My hands trembled with rage as I stared at the bone-dry irrigation channel that had never, not once in the 40 years my family had owned this land, run empty during growing season. The Montana sun beat down like a hammer on anvil, while dust devils danced where water should have flowed. Someone was stealing my water, and when I found out who, they were going to pay. Literally. It all started in early June, right when my alfalfa and winter wheat needed water the most. The irrigation system that fed my 120-acre farm had always been reliable, drawing from the mountain spring that fed into Clearwater Creek before being diverted to various properties in our valley. My grandfather had secured those water rights back in the 1950s, and they were as valuable as the land itself, maybe more so in this increasingly drought-prone region. At first I noticed the water pressure dropping gradually. The sprinklers weren't reaching as far into the fields. The water level in the holding pond was lower than usual. I figured it might be the dry season hitting harder than expected, but when I checked the creek upstream, it still had decent flow. According to my water rights, I was entitled to a specific allocation that should have been more than sufficient for my crops. By the third week of June, the situation had become dire. My wheat was showing signs of stress, the alfalfa was wilting, and my small herd of cattle was gathering around their troughs with confusion in their eyes when barely a trickle came out. I'd never seen anything like it, and panic was settling into my bones. Without water, everything I'd worked for would turn to dust before harvest. That's when I called Mason Greeley, the county water commissioner. Mason was pushing 70 with hands like gnarled oak roots and a disposition nearly as rough. He'd been managing water disputes in the county since before I was born. He arrived in his ancient pickup truck, hat pulled low over his sun-weathered face. "Let's see what we're dealing with, Alex," he muttered, already trudging toward the main irrigation channel. For 2 hours, Mason checked my irrigation system. He measured flow rates, inspected diversion gates, and walked the length of my main channel, all while mumbling to himself and jotting notes on a worn clipboard. Finally he stopped, took off his hat, and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "I've been doing this job for 38 years, and I know theft when I see it," he said, eyes narrowing. "Someone's diverting your allocation before it even reaches your property line." I shook my head in disbelief. Who would do that? Stealing. Water is a felony in this state, Mason finished for me, and given the amount we're talking about, they could face serious charges, but proving it, he trailed off, looking toward the direction of my property line. I followed his gaze, and suddenly it clicked. Diane Porter. Mason didn't confirm or deny, but the look in his eyes told me everything. Diane Porter had purchased the adjacent property just over a year ago. A wealthy divorcee from Los Angeles, she'd moved to our rural community with grandiose plans to create what she called a sustainable luxury retreat. The locals had watched with a mixture of curiosity and irritation as construction crews transformed the old Davidson place into something that belonged in a vacation magazine, not nestled against the foothills of our working agricultural community. A sprawling main house with floor-to-ceiling windows, a guest house almost as large, extensive, landscaping with non-native plants, and most notably, a series of decorative ponds and an Olympic-sized swimming pool that seemed to be perpetually filled despite water conservation notices affecting everyone else in the county. From day one, Diane had made it clear she considered herself above local customs. She complained about the smell of cattle, the sound of farm equipment, and had even filed petitions to restrict farming operations during what she called retreat season. She'd made enemies quickly, but with her money and connections, most people just avoided her rather than risking conflict. But now it seemed she'd crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. "I need proof," I said, more to myself than to Mason. He nodded solemnly. "You sure do. Without it, this becomes a he said, she said situation. and folks with fancy lawyers tend to win those. He handed me his card with a number scrawled on the back. Call me when you find something concrete. Don't do anything stupid in the meantime. After Mason left, I sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, trying to formulate a plan. Through my window, I could see Diane's property in the distance, lights illuminating her ornamental waterfall well past midnight, while my crops withered. The injustice burned in my chest, That night I barely slept. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I grabbed my work boots, a flashlight, and my phone's camera. I was going to find out exactly how she was doing this. I started at the diversion point where Clearwater Creek split two, served different properties. Everything looked normal there, no obvious tampering. I followed the main channel toward my property, checking every access point and junction. Nothing seemed out of place until I reached the section that ran along the border between my land and Diane's. There, partially hidden beneath a cluster of newly planted willow trees, I spotted something that made my blood boil. A secondary pipe had been installed, diverting water from my channel before it ever reached my property. The pipe was expertly camouflaged with rocks and native plants, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. A theft operation, plain and simple. I took dozens of photos from every angle, making sure to capture how the pipe connected to my water channel. Then I followed the illegal pipe, staying low and out of sight of Diane's house. It ran underground for about 50 yards before emerging inside a small pump house on her property. From there, additional pipes branched out toward her swimming pool, ornamental ponds, and extensive sprinkler system. The audacity was breathtaking. She hadn't just tapped into my water supply, she'd engineered an entire system to steal it systematically. All while my farm, my livelihood, was literally dying of thirst. As I stood there gathering evidence and seething with rage, I knew this wasn't just about getting my water back. This was about justice. And Diane Porter was about to learn that. In Montana, water theft wasn't just illegal, it was a declaration of war. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything. I took photos from every angle, recorded video of the water flowing through her illegal pipeline, and even measured the diameter of the pipe to calculate approximately how much water she was stealing. Once I had enough evidence, I called Mason. "You found something," he said. "It wasn't a question. A full diversion system, professionally installed. She's taking at least 60% of my allocation before it ever reaches my land." Mason let out a low whistle. "That's brazen, even for city folk. Send me those photos. I'll start the paperwork for a cease and desist order, but that'll take time. The county's backlogged with water disputes this summer." "How much time?" I asked, anxiety creeping into my voice. 2 weeks minimum, maybe a month. My heart sank. "Mason, my crops won't last a month. Hell, they might not last another week without proper irrigation." There was a long pause on the line. "Look, Alex, officially, I have to tell you to wait for the legal process. Unofficially," he cleared his throat, "just remember that your water rights are legally enforceable. Do what you need to do, but be smart about it." I understood what he wasn't saying. The legal system might be slow, but there was nothing stopping me from protecting what was rightfully mine. I decided to try a direct approach first. Maybe, just maybe, Diane didn't realize the severity of what she'd done. It was a slim hope, but worth a shot before things escalated further. Around midday, I drove up to her elaborate entrance gate and pressed the intercom button. After a few moments, Diane's voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes, who is it?" "It's Alex Mercer, your neighbor. We need to talk about a water issue." A long pause followed. "I'm in the middle of a meditation session. Can this wait?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "No, it can't. It's about my irrigation water that's being diverted to your property. It's an urgent matter." Another pause. "Fine, give me 15 minutes. 25 minutes later, the ornate iron gate finally swung open. I drove up the winding driveway, past perfectly manicured gardens that shouldn't have been possible in our climate, especially during a drought. The main house rose before me, a modernist monstrosity of glass and stone that looked painfully out of place against the Montana landscape. Diane was waiting on her extensive patio, wearing what looked like designer yoga clothes and nursing some kind of green smoothie. Her face was carefully neutral, but her eyes darted nervously as I approached. "Alex, isn't it? What can I do for you?" Her tone was pleasant enough, but there was an edge to it. "I think you know why I'm here," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering just below the surface. "Someone has installed an illegal diversion from my water allocation to your property. My farm is dying while you're—" I gestured to the Olympic-sized pool visible behind her. "Water features are flourishing." Diane took a long sip of her smoothie before responding. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof that I'm involved?" "Proof?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken that morning. "The pipeline runs directly from my irrigation channel to your pump house. It's not exactly subtle once you know what to look for." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I had extensive landscaping work done when I purchased the property. My contractors handled all the utilities and water access. If there's been some kind of misunderstanding about water rights, I'm sure we can sort it out amicably." "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said, scrolling to a particularly damning photo that clearly showed her pump house connected to my water supply. "This is water theft. It's a felony in Montana." Diane's pleasant mask slipped for a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "Let's not throw around legal terms, shall we? I purchased this property with the understanding that all water access was legitimate. If my contractors took shortcuts, that's hardly my responsibility." I stared at her in disbelief. "Your shortcuts are killing my farm. I have multi-generational water rights that are being violated." She waved a dismissive hand. "Water rights are such an archaic concept, don't you think? In California, we have a much more progressive approach to resource sharing." "This isn't California," I said through gritted teeth, "and we're not sharing anything. You're stealing my livelihood." "Well, what do you expect me to do?" she asked, irritation finally breaking through her calm facade. "Let my investment wither while you water—" "What, alfalfa? Do you have any idea how much I've put into creating this retreat? I don't care if you've invested $1 billion. That water is legally mine, and I need it back today." Diane set down her glass with a sharp clink. "That's not going to happen. My first guests arrive next week, and I need this place looking perfect. I've already spent a fortune on marketing." "So your business is more important than mine?" I asked incredulously. "Frankly, yes," she said with surprising candor. "Your little farm produces what, 100,000 a year in revenue? My retreat will bring in that much in a month. It's simple economics." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "I'm giving you one chance to do the right thing. Disconnect that pipeline today, or I'll be forced to take action." She actually laughed. "What action? Call the county? Go ahead. By the time they process your complaint, summer will be over. Sue me. I have a legal team on retainer that would bury you in paperwork for years." She picked up her smoothie again. "Face reality, Alex. Times are changing. Traditional agriculture is giving way to more lucrative ventures. Maybe it's time to sell your farm and adapt." In that moment, I understood that there would be no reasoning with Diane Porter. She wasn't ignorant of what she'd done. She simply didn't care. To her, my family farm was collateral damage in her quest for profit. I tried to be reasonable. I said quietly, "Remember that." I turned and walked back to my truck, Diane's voice calling after me. "Don't do anything foolish, Alex. My security cameras record everything." As I drove back down her ridiculous driveway, my mind was racing. Mason had said the official process would take weeks, time my crops didn't have. Diane had made it clear she had no intention of stopping voluntarily. That left me with only one option: take matters into my own hands. Back at my farm, I gathered the tools I'd need: pipe cutters, wrenches, concrete mix, and a small portable camera of my own. If Diane wanted to play the security footage game, I could play too. Documentation would be my protection. I waited until dusk, when the fading light would provide some cover, but still allow me to see what I was doing. Then I made my way back to the illegal diversion point. My plan was simple but effective. I would cut off her stolen water supply and permanently seal the connection point so it couldn't be easily restored. Working quickly and methodically, I cut through the diversion pipe and capped my side with a welded steel plate. Then I mixed a small batch of quick-setting concrete and covered the access point where her system connected to mine. For good measure, I installed my own camera, hidden in a nearby tree, aimed directly at the spot. If she tried to reconnect, I'd have evidence. As a finishing touch, I placed a weatherproof sign next to the concrete patch. Illegal water diversion. Violators will be prosecuted. Montana Water Code Section 85-122. The whole operation took less than an hour. As I gathered my tools and prepared to leave, I felt a grim satisfaction. My water would now flow where it belonged, to my dying crops and thirsty livestock. Diane's stolen supply had been cut off completely. Cut off. I knew there would be consequences. Diane wouldn't take this lying down, but I was prepared for whatever came next. In the battle for water in the West, possession was 9/10 of the law, and I had just reclaimed what was rightfully mine. What I didn't anticipate was just how quickly Diane would realize what had happened, or how dramatically she would respond. I was in the barn checking on a pregnant heifer when my phone buzzed with a security alert. The camera I'd installed had detected movement at the diversion point. I opened the app and watched in real time as Diane, still in what appeared to be silk pajamas, stood at the concrete-sealed connection point, gesturing wildly and shouting into her phone. She looked nothing like the composed yoga enthusiast from yesterday. Her hair was disheveled, her designer sleepwear was getting soiled as she paced around the muddy area, and her face was contorted with rage. It was both satisfying and slightly unnerving to see her composure so completely shattered. Finished with the heifer and headed to the house for coffee, knowing it wouldn't be long before I heard from her directly. Sure enough, as I poured my first cup, my phone rang. Diane's name flashed on the screen. "Good morning," I answered calmly. "What have you done?" Her voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Reclaim my water rights," I replied, taking a sip of coffee. "The illegal diversion has been removed. You had no right to touch my property. Do you have any idea what you've done? My entire water system is down. My landscaping is already wilting. The pool is dropping. I have guests arriving in 5 days. "Actually, I had every legal right," I said. "That water was never yours to take. I've simply corrected an illegal situation." "I've already called my lawyer," she hissed. "You'll be served with papers by this afternoon. I'm suing you for property damage, trespassing, and lost business revenue. And I've already sent documentation of your water theft to the county commissioner and the state water board," I countered, "including photos of the illegal diversion you installed and video of our conversation yesterday where you essentially admitted knowing about it." That stopped her momentarily. I could almost hear her recalculating her approach. "Listen," she said, her voice suddenly softer, but with an edge like a badly concealed knife. "We got off on the wrong foot. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits us both. What if I paid you for water access? Name your price." I almost laughed. Now that she was facing consequences, she wanted to negotiate. "It's not about money, Diane. That water sustains my livelihood. It's not for sale." "Everyone has a price," she insisted. 10,000? 20? "Not interested." $50,000, she said flatly. Cash, today. Just reconnect my system and we'll forget this unpleasantness. I paused, not because I was considering her offer, but because I was genuinely shocked by the desperation in her voice. She was willing to pay $50,000, rather than connect to the county water supply like everyone else. The answer is still no, I said finally. You need to get a legal water hookup like every other property owner in the county. She was quiet for a moment. Then her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than her shouting. You're going to regret this, Alex. I promise you that. The line went dead. By noon, Diane had made good on at least one of her threats. A man in a sleek black sedan pulled up to my house and served me with papers, a temporary restraining order preventing me from further damaging or interfering with water infrastructure on the property line. It was clearly hastily drafted and would likely be thrown out in court, but it was a nuisance nonetheless. I called Mason immediately. She works fast, he said after I explained the situation. But this is actually good news. How is being served with legal papers good news? I asked. Because she's acknowledging the existence of the diversion system, Mason said. She can't claim it doesn't exist if she's filing legal documents about it. The TRO is just a delay tactic. I've expedited your complaint with the water board, but you should be prepared for more trouble. What kind of trouble? Mason sighed. People like her don't give up easily, and they don't play by the same rules as the rest of us. He was right. By late afternoon, a convoy of vehicles arrived at Diane's property, a water tanker truck, followed by 3 more throughout the day. She was having water delivered to maintain her landscaping and fill her pool. It must have cost a fortune, but it was clear she was determined to keep her retreat opening on schedule, no matter the cost. And that wasn't all. The next morning, I woke to find a sheriff's deputy at my door. Diane had filed a formal complaint alleging that I had trespassed and vandalized her property. I'm just following procedure. The deputy, a woman named Rodriguez, who knew my family, said apologetically, I have to take a statement. I invited her in and showed her all my documentation. The photos of the illegal diversion, the video of my conversation with Diane, and the consultation with Mason. Deputy Rodriguez reviewed everything carefully, then closed her notebook with a sigh. Between you and me, this complaint isn't going anywhere. It's pretty clear what happened here, but Ms. Porter seems to have connections with the county commissioner's office, so we have to dot every I and cross every T. I appreciate your thoroughness, I said, walking her to the door. The deputy paused before leaving. Just a heads up, Ms. Porter has hired private security for her property. 2 men, ex-military types. They're legally allowed to be there, but just keep your distance and be careful. After she left, I went to check on my irrigation system. With the illegal diversion sealed off, water was flowing properly to my fields for the first time in weeks. The crops were still stressed, but with proper irrigation, they'd recover. My mood lifted as I watched the sprinklers working at full capacity again. That good feeling lasted until mid-afternoon, when I got a call from my neighbor on the other side of my property, Bill Hoffman. Hey, Alex, you having water problems again? He asked. My stomach dropped. Why? What's happening? My water pressure just dropped to almost nothing. Reminds me of when my line got clogged with debris last spring after the flooding. I thanked him and immediately went to check my main irrigation channel where it entered my property. Everything seemed normal, but as I followed it downstream, I noticed the water level dropping. About a quarter-mile in, I found the problem. Someone had dumped several bags of quick-setting concrete directly into my irrigation channel, creating a dam that was blocking most of the water flow. Beside it, stuck in the mud, was an empty water bottle with a label from Harmony Springs, the luxury brand stocked at Diane's retreat. This wasn't just petty revenge. This was deliberate sabotage that affected not just me, but potentially other farms downstream that relied on the same water system. I took photos of the concrete dam and the bottle, then got to work clearing it out. It took hours of back-breaking labor with a pickaxe and shovel to remove enough of the obstruction to restore decent water flow. By the time I finished, the sun was setting and I was covered in mud and concrete dust. I was exhausted, furious, and now absolutely certain that this conflict with Diane had moved beyond a simple water dispute into something much uglier. I called Mason again and sent him the photos. "This crosses a line," he said gravely. "Tampering with irrigation infrastructure that affects multiple users is a serious offense. I'm calling the sheriff personally about this." "She'll just deny it," I said bitterly. "The water bottle isn't exactly conclusive proof. Maybe not for criminal charges, but it strengthens our case with the water board," Mason replied. "In the meantime, I'd suggest setting up more cameras along your irrigation channels. This might not be her only attempt at retaliation." That night, I installed 3 more security cameras at strategic points along my water system. If Diane or her hired help tried anything else, I'd have evidence. I also bought motion sensor lights and set them up near the most vulnerable sections of the irrigation channels. As I worked, I couldn't help but wonder how things had escalated so quickly. What had started as a simple water theft had morphed into a full-blown rural feud, complete with legal threats, security personnel, and outright sabotage. What I didn't realize yet was that we were still just in the opening rounds. Diane Porter was about to take this war to an entirely new level, one that would involve the entire community and force me to decide just how far I was willing to go to protect my farm and my water rights. 2 days after the concrete incident, Diane made her next move. It wasn't another direct attack on my water system. It was something far more insidious. I was at the Pinewood Valley General Store picking up supplies when Marge, the owner who had known me since I was in diapers, pulled me aside with a concerned, "Look, Alex, have you seen this?" She handed me a glossy flyer that looked wildly out of place among the usual community bulletins and lost pet notices on her corkboard. "Urgent community alert," the headline screamed in bold red letters. Below it was a professional photo of Diane, looking appropriately concerned, standing in front of what appeared to be a dried-up section of Clearwater Creek, carefully framed, to hide the fact that it was a seasonal tributary that always ran dry in summer. The text beneath was even more outrageous. "Local farmer threatens valley's water future. Alex Mercer's outdated irrigation practices, wasting thousands of gallons, while new conservation efforts are blocked. Community meeting Thursday, 7 p.m. at Riverview Hall to discuss sustainable water usage for all residents." I read it twice, unable to believe the sheer audacity. "She's been handing these out all over town," Marge said. "Left a stack at the diner, the feed store, even the school. People are talking." "This is complete fiction," I said, my voice tight with anger. "She's the one who was stealing water." Marge patted my arm. "Most folks who've been here a while know your family, Alex. We know how you operate, but..." "But what?" She hesitated. "There are a lot of new people in the valley these days. Weekend warriors with vacation properties. Retirees from out of state. They don't know the history or understand water rights, and some of them are buying into her story." I left the store with the flyer crumpled in my fist, my mind racing. This wasn't just an attack on my water, it was an attack on my reputation, my family legacy, and my standing in the community. Diane was trying to paint me as the villain to generate public pressure. When I got home, I called Mason immediately. He had already seen the flyer. "This is a classic developer tactic," he said, wearily, "trying to reframe the narrative and build public support. I've seen it before when big money moves into agricultural communities." "What do I do?" I asked. "Show up at that meeting," Mason said firmly. "Bring your documentation. I'll be there too with the official water allocation records. We're not letting her control this story." Over the next 2 days, I prepared meticulously for the meeting. I printed in large photos of the illegal diversion, created simple charts showing my water usage compared to my legal allocation, and even filmed a short video walking through how the theft had occurred. I wasn't going to let Diane's slick PR campaign overwhelm the facts. Thursday evening, I arrived at Riverview Hall 30 minutes early, only to find the parking lot already nearly full. Inside, the community space had been transformed. A podium with a professional sound system stood at the front, flanked by large displays showing idyllic images of Diane's retreat, alongside charts about modern water conservation techniques. Refreshment tables lined one wall, offering wine, cheese, and fancy appetizers I couldn't even name. This wasn't a community meeting. It was a carefully orchestrated performance. People were milling around, many of whom I recognized as long-time residents, but many more I didn't. The newcomers were easy to spot. They clustered together, examining Diane's displays with impressed nods. I set up my much humbler materials on a folding table near the entrance, determined that people would at least see the evidence before being swept up in Diane's presentation. A few neighbors stopped by, examining the photos with frowns of concern. Bill Hoffman approached, looking troubled. "Alex, this doesn't look good. She's got the county supervisor here, and I just overheard that someone from the state environmental agency is coming too." My stomach tightened. This was bigger than I'd anticipated. At precisely 7 p.m., Diane stepped up to the podium in an outfit that somehow managed to look both expensive and like a costume approximation of casual rural wear. Designer jeans, a crisp flannel shirt that had clearly never seen a day of work, and impeccably clean boots. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice warm and practiced. "I'm Diane Porter, and like many of you, I fell in love with Pinewood Valley because of its natural beauty and resources. When I established Clearwater Wellness Retreat, I made a commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainable practices. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Without ever directly accusing me by name, she painted a picture of traditional agricultural practices that were stuck in the past and wasting precious resources. She presented her retreat as a model of water conservation, conveniently omitting the Olympic-sized pool and decorative water features. "The future of our valley depends on modern approaches to water usage," she continued, clicking through slides showing declining reservoir levels and climate change projections. "We can no longer afford to flood fields the way our grandparents did. Every drop counts." Then came the real purpose of the meeting, her proposal. Diane wanted to establish a Valley Water Conservation Committee that would have authority to review and approve water usage plans for all properties. The committee would be volunteer-based, but would require expertise in modern conservation techniques, expertise that coincidentally she and her city friends possessed. It was a blatant power grab disguised as environmental concern. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I was the first to raise my hand. Diane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she acknowledged me. "Miss Porter," I said, standing to address not just her, but the entire room. "You've talked a lot about conservation tonight, but you haven't mentioned the illegal water diversion that was discovered on your property last week. A diversion that was stealing water from my legally established water allocation and sending it to your retreat." A murmur ran through the crowd. I pressed on, holding up one of my enlarged photos. "This pipe was installed without permits or water rights, taking water that has belonged to my farm for generations. When confronted, you offered to pay me to keep quiet about it, rather than obtain a legal water connection." Diane's composure slipped for just a moment before she recovered. "Mr. Mercer is referring to an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding an irrigation line that my contractors installed. As soon as the issue was brought to my attention, I took steps to rectify it. By dumping concrete into my irrigation channel," I countered, holding up another photo. Is that what you call rectifying? The room erupted in shocked whispers. Diane quickly regained control of the microphone. These are serious allegations that have no place in a community discussion. If Mr. Mercer has concerns, the appropriate venue is through proper legal channels, not public accusations. Before I could respond, a man in an expensive-looking suit stood up. As Ms. Porter's attorney, I must caution against further defamatory statements. We are currently pursuing legal action regarding Mr. Mercer's destruction of private property and unauthorized modifications to shared water infrastructure. The meeting devolved from there. Some long-time residents stood up to defend me and my family's reputation, while others, mostly newcomers, expressed support for Diane's forward-thinking proposals. The county supervisor, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, suggested forming a task force to study the issue further. By the time the meeting ended, the community was clearly divided. As people filed out, some neighbors patted me on the back in solidarity, while others avoided eye contact entirely. Diane stood by the door, shaking hands and smiling, as if the entire confrontation had never happened. Mason joined me as I packed up my materials. "You did well," he said quietly. "She didn't expect you to have such clear evidence or to speak up so directly." "But she still managed to spin it," I replied bitterly. "Half the room probably thinks I'm a water-wasting dinosaur fighting against progress." "Maybe," Mason conceded, "but the other half saw through her act. And more importantly, now everyone knows there's another side to the story. This isn't over." He was right about that. The next morning, I woke to find 3 messages on my answering machine from local news outlets wanting interviews about the water dispute. Diane's attempt to control the narrative had inadvertently thrust our conflict into the spotlight. But the real surprise came when I checked my email. There were dozens of messages from community members, some I knew, many I didn't, expressing support and sharing their own stories of run-ins with Diane or concerns about wealthy out-of-towners, changing the character of our valley. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from a man named Stephen Chen, identifying himself as a former contractor who had worked on the initial construction of Diane's retreat. "I quit the job halfway through because of ethical concerns," he wrote. "Ms. Porter specifically instructed us to find ways to access water without paying county fees. When I suggested following proper procedures, I was removed from the project. I have documentation that might help your case." I forwarded the email to Mason immediately, a glimmer of hope rising. Maybe the tide was turning. Maybe the truth would actually matter. What I didn't know then was that Diane was already formulating her next move, one that would make our conflict personal in ways I couldn't have imagined, and force me to decide just how far I was willing to go to protect not just my water, but everything and everyone I cared about. The morning after the community meeting, I met with Stephen Chen at the local diner. He was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, with calloused hands and tired eyes. He slid a manila folder across the table without preamble. "These are the original plans for Ms. Porter's water system," he said quietly. "The ones submitted to the county for permits, and then the actual plans we were instructed to follow. You'll notice they don't match." I opened the folder and compared the documents. The permitted plans showed a standard connection to the county water supply with reasonable usage estimates. The actual plans included the illegal diversion from my irrigation channel, plus a complex system of underground storage tanks that could hold thousands of gallons, far beyond what anyone would need for normal residential use. "Why would she need this much water?" I asked, flipping through the technical drawings. Stephen's mouth tightened. "The retreat isn't just for wellness tourism. Ms. Porter is planning to bottle and sell the water." "What?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "There's a building on the property plans labeled packaging facility. When I questioned it, I was told it was for guest amenities. But I saw the equipment being delivered. It's a small-scale water bottling operation. She's planning to market Clearwater Springs as premium mountain water to high-end retailers. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Diane's obsession with controlling the water wasn't just about her retreats, landscaping, or pool. She was planning to commodify our valley's water and sell it for profit. No wonder she'd been willing to offer me $50,000 to keep quiet. That was probably just a fraction of what she stood to make. "This changes everything," I said, carefully returning the documents to the folder. "Thank you for coming. Forward." Stephen nodded grimly. "Just be careful." When I raised concerns about the legality of her plans, strange things started happening. My other clients suddenly cancelled contracts. My work truck was vandalized. Then I got an anonymous offer to buy my contracting business for way below market value. He lowered his voice. "Ms. Porter has connections beyond this valley, powerful ones." His warning stuck with me as I drove to Mason's office to share the new information. This wasn't just about a water dispute anymore. It was about stopping a scheme that could impact the entire valley's water supply for years to come. Mason reviewed the documents with growing alarm. "This is a major violation of water rights and commercial zoning laws. Her property isn't approved for industrial use, let alone commercial water extraction." He looked up at me. "We need to take this to the county commissioners immediately." But before we could even schedule a meeting, Diane's next attack landed, and this time it was deeply personal. I was fixing a fence line that afternoon when my phone rang. It was my sister Laura, who lived in Missoula with her family. "Alex, what the hell is going on?" Her voice was tense with worry. "My boss just called me into his office to ask if we were about to lose the farm to foreclosure." "What?" "No, we're fine." "Why would he think that?" "Because someone sent an anonymous email to everyone in my company claiming the Mercer farm is failing financially and that you're trying to extort money from neighbors over water rights to avoid bankruptcy." My blood ran cold. "That's completely false." "I know that," Laura snapped, "but now I've got colleagues looking at me with pity and my boss wondering if I'm going to have a family emergency that takes me away from work." The calls kept coming. Throughout the day, my cousin who ran a business in the next county over, my elderly aunt in the retirement home, even my former high school teacher. Somehow, Diane had researched my family connections and launched a coordinated campaign of whispers and innuendo, spreading false financial rumors that could damage not just my reputation, but my entire family's. The local bank manager even called, awkwardly asking if I wanted to discuss options regarding my farm loan, a loan that was in perfectly good standing. Customers who had pre-ordered fall hay deliveries called asking for reassurance that I'd still be in business. The damage was spreading like wildfire. I was seething with rage by the time I got home, only to find a sleek white envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a business card for a real estate agent specializing in distressed agricultural properties, and a handwritten note. "I heard you might be facing difficult decisions. I have buyers interested in properties like yours who pay cash and close quickly. Call any time." The card went straight into my wood stove, but the message was clear. Diane was trying to pressure me from all angles, personal and professional. That night, I could barely sleep. My phone kept buzzing with text messages from concerned friends and family asking if the rumors were true. By morning, I was exhausted and furious, but determined not to let Diane's tactics succeed. I drove into town and marched straight into the Pinewood Valley Gazette, our small local newspaper. Hank Williams, the editor and owner, had known my family for decades. I found him at his desk, already looking troubled as I walked in. "I guess you've heard the rumors," I said without preamble. Hank nodded sadly. "Got 3 different, anonymous tips about your farm's financial troubles yesterday. Didn't believe a word of it, of course." "I want to set the record straight," I said firmly, "and I want to tell the full story. The water theft, the illegal bottling operation plans, all of it." Hank leaned back in his chair. That's a serious set of allegations against someone with deep pockets and a tendency to file lawsuits. I have documentation for everything, I replied, placing Stephen's folder on his desk. And it's time the whole truth came out. For the next 2 hours, I sat with Hank, going through every detail of my conflict with Diane. He took meticulous notes, examining each piece of evidence with the careful eye of an old-school journalist. When we finished, he removed his reading glasses and wiped them thoughtfully. "This will be the front page of tomorrow's edition," he promised. "But Alex, you should know, this is going to escalate things significantly. Ms. Porter isn't going to take a public exposure of her plans lying down." I nodded grimly. "I'm counting on it." While I was at the newspaper office, I received an urgent call from Bill Hoffman. His voice was tight with concern. "Alex, you need to get back to your property right away. There are people on your land." I raced home to find 3 men in suits walking my fields, taking photographs and measurements. A black luxury SUV with tinted windows was parked at the edge of my driveway. I slammed my truck to a halt and jumped out. "This is private property. Who are you people?" The men turned, looking completely unperturbed by my arrival. The oldest of them, a silver-haired man with an expensive watch gleaming in the sunlight, stepped forward with the confidence of someone used to automatic deference. "Mr. Mercer, I presume." "I'm Jeffrey Harmon, Senior Environmental Compliance Officer with the State Department of Natural Resources." He handed me a business card that looked legitimate. "We've received a formal complaint about water code violations and environmental damage occurring on this property." "What violations?" "This farm has been in full compliance for generations." Harmon consulted a tablet. "We have reports of excessive water usage, improper chemical storage, and potential groundwater contamination. We'll need full access to your property to conduct a thorough inspection." I stared at him in disbelief. This had Diane written all over it. "Do you have a warrant?" I asked. Harmon's professional smile never wavered. "We don't need one for an initial environmental assessment, Mr. Mercer. But if you prefer to make this difficult, we can certainly return with one, along with a citation for obstruction." I was trapped, and we both knew it. "Fine, but I'm accompanying you every step of the way." For the next 3 hours, I followed the inspection team around my property as they scrutinized every aspect of my operation. They took water samples from my irrigation channels, soil samples from my fields, and photographs of my equipment storage areas. They examined my fertilizer shed with particular attention, taking detailed notes about perfectly normal agricultural supplies. Throughout the inspection, I could feel the noose tightening. They weren't finding actual violations because there weren't any, but they were clearly looking for any technicality, any minor infraction they could use. The message was clear. Diane had connections at the state level, and she was using them to bring regulatory pressure on me. When they finally left, promising a detailed report within 10 business days, I sat on my porch steps, momentarily overwhelmed. Diane had escalated from water theft to community manipulation to personal attacks, and now to potential regulatory harassment. How was I supposed to fight on so many fronts simultaneously? The answer came from an unexpected source. As the sun was setting, 3 pickup trucks pulled into my driveway. Bill Hoffman stepped out of the first one, followed by the Petersons from down the valley, and old Jim Baker, who ran the organic farm on the North Ridge. "Heard you had state inspectors out here today," Bill said without preamble. "Figured you could use some support." I stood, genuinely moved by their presence. "I appreciate it, but I'm not sure what anyone can do. Diane seems to have unlimited resources and connections." Jim Baker, a Vietnam veteran with a permanently stern expression, spoke up. "That fancy lady doesn't understand something important. In this valley, we still believe in neighbors helping neighbors." The Petersons nodded in agreement. "We saw what happened at that community meeting," Sarah Peterson said. "It's obvious she's trying to bully you off your land. We're not standing for it." "We've been talking," Bill added. "A bunch of us old-timers with water rights. If Porter thinks she can come in here and rewrite the rules that have governed this valley for generations, she's about to learn otherwise." For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The community, the real community, not Diane's imported allies, was rallying behind me. What none of us realized that evening was that Diane was about to make a catastrophic miscalculation, one that would finally turn the tide in this water war and lead to consequences far beyond what she could have anticipated. The next morning, Hank Williams kept his promise. The Pinewood Valley Gazette hit newsstands with a front-page headline that pulled no punches. "Water theft and commercial bottling scheme uncovered at luxury retreat." The article laid out the entire story: the illegal diversion, the confrontation, the community meeting manipulation, and most damaging of all, the secret plans for a commercial water bottling operation that violated zoning laws, water rights, and business permits. Hank had done his due diligence, including statements from Stephen Chen, documentation of the illegal pipeline, and quotes from Mason about water rights violations. He'd even reached out to Diane for comment, noting at the end of the article that Ms. Porter declined to respond to specific allegations, but stated through her attorney that all claims were defamatory and without merit. By mid-morning, the story had been picked up by the regional news. By afternoon, a reporter from the state capitol had called me requesting an interview. The spotlight that Diane had tried to aim at me was now shining directly on her, and she clearly didn't appreciate the exposure. I was in the field checking irrigation lines when Mason called. "Have you heard what happened at the county offices this morning?" he asked without greeting. "No, what's going on?" Diane showed up with her lawyer and 2 consultants, demanding an emergency meeting with the county commissioners. When they told her she needed to schedule like everyone else, she threw a fit in the lobby, yelling about corruption and threatening to sue the entire county government. I couldn't help but smile. Sounds like the Gazette article hit a nerve. "That's not all," Mason continued. "Someone recorded the whole meltdown on their phone. It's already making the rounds on social media. She does not come across well, Alex. At one point she says, and I quote, 'Do you people know who I am? I've donated more to political campaigns than this backwater county's entire budget.'" I winced. In a community where humility and neighborliness were core values, that kind of entitled outburst was social suicide. "The commissioners have called an emergency session for tomorrow morning," Mason added. "They're reviewing all of Porter's permits and applications in light of the new information about the bottling operation. I need you there with all your documentation." The next morning, I arrived at the county building to find the parking lot packed. Word had spread about the special session, and it seemed like half the valley had shown up. Inside, the meeting room was standing room only, with a clear division among attendees, long-time residents on one side, Diane's supporters, noticeably fewer than at her community meeting, on the other. Diane arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by her attorney and what appeared to be a public relations consultant who kept whispering in her ear. She had abandoned her fake country casual look for a power suit that screamed big city money. Her expression was tight but composed. Clearly, she'd been coached not to repeat her lobby meltdown. County Commissioner Martha Blackwell, a no-nonsense woman who'd grown up on a ranch herself, called the meeting to order. "We're here to review serious allegations regarding water rights violations and unauthorized commercial activities. This is not a trial or a formal hearing, but a fact-finding session to determine if further action is warranted." For the next hour, various officials presented findings. The county water manager detailed the illegal diversion discovered on my property line. The zoning administrator explained how a commercial bottling operation would violate the retreat's permitted use. The environmental compliance officer noted potential watershed impacts of large-scale water extraction. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple and factual, presenting the photos, Stephen Chen's documents, and a timeline of events. Throughout my testimony, I could feel Diane's glare burning into me, but I never looked her way. Finally, it was Diane's turn. Her attorney started with predictable denials and accusations of persecution by agricultural interests resistant to progress. But when Commissioner Blackwell pressed for specific responses to the bottling operation evidence, the lawyer's smooth evasions faltered. Diane, clearly frustrated with her attorney's performance, suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Yes, I plan to bottle water, so what? It's a premium product that would bring revenue and jobs to this backward community. The way you people cling to outdated water rights and farming practices is exactly why rural economies are failing." Across the country, a murmur ran through the crowd. Commissioner Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "Ms. Porter, are you acknowledging that you intentionally concealed a commercial water bottling operation in your permit applications?" "I didn't conceal anything," Diane said dismissively. "I simply didn't highlight aspects that would trigger unnecessary red tape. Every successful business has to navigate around obstructive regulations. It's called entrepreneurship." The room went silent. Even Diane's attorney looked pained. Commissioner Blackwell leaned forward. "Let me be clear, Ms. Porter. In this county, we don't consider our laws and regulations red tape to be navigated around. They exist to protect our resources and community interests." "Look," Diane said, her composure cracking, "everyone has their price. Just tell me who I need to talk to and what it will cost to make this go away. Is it donations to the county fund? A new park? Name it." That was the moment she lost completely. The room erupted in outrage. Commissioner Blackwell banged her gavel repeatedly to restore order, her face flushed with anger. "Ms. Porter, are you suggesting a bribe to county officials in an open meeting on the record?" Diane suddenly seemed to realize what she'd done. Her PR consultant was already backing toward the door, distancing himself from the disaster unfolding. Her attorney was frantically scribbling notes, likely calculating how quickly he could terminate their relationship. "I didn't mean," Diane stammered, but the damage was done. "This session is adjourned," Commissioner Blackwell announced. "The board will deliberate and issue findings within 5 business days. In the meantime, all permits associated with Clearwater Wellness Retreat are suspended pending review." As the crowd dispersed, the atmosphere had completely changed. People who had been cautiously neutral were now openly avoiding Diane. Several who had supported her at the community meeting were engaged in heated whispers, clearly reassessing their alignment. I was gathering my documents when Bill Hoffman approached with a satisfied smile. "That couldn't have gone better if we'd planned it." "I almost feel sorry for her," I admitted. "Almost." "Don't waste your sympathy," Bill replied. "She's still dangerous. Cornered animals fight the hardest." He was right. That evening, as I returned home from checking on a sick calf, I found my front gate blocked by Diane's black SUV. She was sitting on my porch steps, waiting. I approached cautiously, remembering Deputy Rodriguez's warning about Diane's private security, but she appeared to be alone. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked, keeping my distance. Diane stood. In the fading light, I could see that her perfect composure had crumbled. Her hair was disheveled, her expensive suit wrinkled. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "Do you have any idea what this retreat meant to me? It wasn't just a business, it was my fresh start." "A fresh start built on stealing someone else's water," I pointed out. She waved this away impatiently. "I want to make you a final offer. 1 million for your water rights and a non-disclosure agreement about this entire situation. Cash, untraceable. You can buy a bigger farm somewhere else. Start over without the reputation damage I've caused." I stared at her in disbelief. "You still don't get it, do you? This land isn't just property to me. It's my heritage, my responsibility, my home. It's not for sale at any price." "Everyone has a price," she insisted. "That's where you've been wrong. From the beginning," I said quietly. "Some things aren't commodities to be bought and sold. The water that feeds this valley has sustained generations of families and farms. It's not just an input for your profit margin." For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across her face. Then her expression hardened. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said coldly. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." She brushed past me and got into her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she accelerated down my driveway. I didn't know it then, but that was the last conversation I would ever have with Diane Porter. The next morning, as dawn was breaking, I was awakened by frantic pounding on my door. It was Sarah Peterson, still in her bathrobe, eyes wide with panic. "Alex, come quickly. The creek, something's wrong with the water." I threw on clothes and followed her to her truck. As we raced toward Clearwater Creek, she explained between gasps. Jim was checking his irrigation intake early. He saw the water was cloudy and smelled strange. He followed it upstream and... She broke off, shaking her head in disbelief. When we reached the creek access point near the old bridge, a small crowd had already gathered. The normally crystal-clear water was running a milky white color, and the unmistakable chemical smell of chlorine hung in the air. "What the hell?" I muttered, kneeling to examine the contaminated water. Mason was already there, his face grim. "Someone dumped what looks like pool chemicals into the creek upstream. We've already called hazmat and the environmental response team." "How bad is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Bad," he said simply. "We're looking at fish die-off, potential damage to riparian habitat and contamination of downstream irrigation water. Every farm that draws from the creek is affected." I immediately thought of Diane's threat. Had she really gone this far? Contaminating a water source that affected the entire valley wasn't just vindictive, it was criminal. "Where exactly did this start?" I asked. Jim Baker pointed upstream. "I traced it to the culvert that runs under Porter's property. It's flowing from there." A county sheriff's deputy was already on the scene, talking rapidly into his radio. When he finished, he approached our group. "I've called for backup and environmental crime specialists from the state," he said. "We'll need to access the Porter property immediately to locate the source." As we waited for authorities to arrive, more valley residents gathered at the creek, watching in horror as the contamination spread. Some brought buckets and containers, frantically collecting clean water from unaffected tributaries to save livestock and gardens. Others were on phones, spreading warnings downstream. In that moment, despite the environmental disaster unfolding before us, I felt something important shift in our community. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Diane had attacked something that belonged to all of us, and the valley was responding as one. Whatever happened next, I knew I wasn't standing alone. Within an hour, Clearwater Creek had become the center of a full-scale environmental emergency response. Sheriff's deputies secured access points along the creek. State environmental officials in hazmat suits collected water samples and set up containment barriers. News vans from the regional stations parked along the main road, reporters filming the unnaturally clouded water and interviewing shocked residents. I stood with Mason and several other farmers watching the hazmat team work, the knot in my stomach tightening as the implications became clear. Even if the contamination could be contained quickly, the damage to our water supply, crops, and livestock could be devastating. "Any word on what exactly was dumped?" I asked a state official who was coordinating the response. Preliminary tests show high concentrations of chlorine, algicides, and pH adjusters, basically commercial pool chemicals, she replied grimly. A lot of them. We're talking hundreds of gallons. The sheriff approached our group, his expression serious. We've secured a warrant for the Porter property. Investigators are on their way there now. What they found made the evening news across the state. Behind Diane's pump house, the same one connected to my illegal water diversion, officials discovered empty containers of pool chemicals stacked haphazardly next to a drainage culvert that fed directly into Clearwater Creek. The labels matched the chemicals detected in the water. Security camera footage from Diane's own system showed her directing workers to dump the chemicals just before dawn. It was the smoking gun. Irrefutable. Evidence of deliberate environmental sabotage, but Diane herself was nowhere to be found. Her SUV is gone, and the house appears to have been hastily vacated, the sheriff told me later that day. We've issued an all-points bulletin and notified Border Patrol, but she had several hours head start. The realization that Diane had fled rather than face consequences sent a wave of both relief and frustration through me. Relief that the immediate threat was gone, frustration that she might escape justice, The next few days were a blur of activity. Emergency meetings with water authorities, coordinating with other affected landowners, setting up alternative water sources for livestock, assessing crop damage. The community pulled together in remarkable ways, neighbors sharing clean water reserves, volunteering equipment, helping each other install temporary filtration systems. 4 days after the contamination, I was installing a new water filter on my main irrigation intake when a black government SUV pulled up. A man and woman in suits approached, showing badges that identified them as FBI agents. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Agent Lowry. This is Agent Pearson. We'd like to ask you some questions about Diane Porter." They interviewed me for over 2 hours, taking detailed notes about the entire water conflict from beginning to end. Their questions were thorough, but revealed little about their investigation. It was only at the end that Agent Lowry gave me a glimpse of the bigger picture. "Ms. Porter's activities here appear to be part of a pattern," she said carefully. "We've been investigating a series of similar land and resource acquisition schemes in several states. The environmental sabotage escalation is new, though. Have you found her?" I asked. "Not yet," Agent Pearson replied, "but we will. The scale of this incident has elevated the priority significantly. They weren't the only ones investigating." 3 days later, Mason called with news. "Remember that bottling operation Stephen Chen mentioned? It wasn't just some boutique side business. I've been digging into Porter's business filings. She's connected to a major beverage conglomerate through a web of shell companies. They've been doing this across the West, buying properties with water rights, then extracting and bottling the water for urban markets." "So this was corporate from the beginning," I said, the pieces finally coming together. She was just the front person. Exactly. And now that her methods have been exposed, there's a paper trail leading back to the parent company. Their stock dropped 15% today after financial news sites started connecting them to the Montana water contamination incident. As the investigation expanded, more details emerged. Diane had used the same playbook in 3 other rural communities, buying property, manipulating local officials, and securing water rights through questionable means. But she had never before resorted to environmental sabotage. That desperate act was proving to be her undoing, and potentially that of her corporate backers as well. 2 weeks after the contamination, with cleanup efforts still ongoing, I received a formal letter from the county commissioners. They had unanimously voted to permanently revoke all permits for Clearwater Wellness Retreat and were initiating proceedings to recover damages from both Diane Porter and her affiliated companies. More importantly, they were implementing new protections for historic water rights and stricter review processes for large-scale developments. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The environmental damage to Clearwater Creek would take years to fully heal. Some crops were lost for the season. The financial impact on the valley's farms was significant, even with emergency assistance funds being arranged. A month after Diane fled, federal marshals finally caught up with her at a private airfield in New Mexico, apparently preparing to leave the country. The news of her arrest made national headlines, along with the corporate scandal that was now unfolding around her employers. As summer turned to fall, life in Pinewood Valley began to return to a tentative normalcy. The immediate crisis had passed, but the experience had left lasting changes in our community. Farmers who had barely spoken to each other for years now gathered regularly to discuss water conservation strategies. Newcomers to the valley made efforts to understand the agricultural heritage they had joined. Even the county government seemed more attentive to balancing development with resource protection. One crisp October morning, I was checking the last irrigation run of the season when Mason's truck pulled up alongside my fields. He rolled down his window, gesturing for me to come over. "Got some news you might be interested in," he said. "The Porter property is going up for county auction next month. Environmental remediation is complete, and back taxes and penalties have been assessed. Thought you might want first crack at it given everything that happened." I leaned against his truck, considering the possibility. What would I even do with it? That place was built to be a rich person's playground, not a working farm. Mason shrugged. Land is land. The main house could be converted to something useful for the community, maybe an agricultural education center or a meeting hall. The rest could be returned to productive farmland. The idea took root in my mind, not as a victory trophy or an expansion of my farm, but as a way to reclaim that piece of the valley for its original purpose, supporting the community rather than exploiting it. When auction day came, I wasn't the only local resident who showed up. A dozen farmers and longtime valley families had pooled resources to bid together. Even some of the more conservation-minded newcomers joined our coalition. We had all agreed whoever won would ensure the property served the community's needs, not outside interests. The corporate owners, now facing multiple lawsuits and federal investigations, had abandoned any claim to the property. When the auctioneer opened bidding, our group's offer stood unopposed. For a fraction of what Diane had invested in her luxury retreat, the property returned to local ownership. In the spring, we began the transformation. The ostentatious main house became the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Center, hosting 4-H meetings, farming workshops, and community events. The over-landscaped grounds were replanted with native species and demonstration gardens. The infamous swimming pool was converted into a rainwater harvesting reservoir that helped supply a community garden. Most significantly, we restored the natural flow of the tributary that ran through the property into Clearwater Creek, removing the elaborate water features and returning the watershed to its natural state. Water that had once been diverted for private luxury now nourished community food production and education. 1 year to the day after Diane contaminated our creek, we held a community celebration at the transformed property. Tables laden with food produced by local farms stretched across the lawn. Children played in the meadow where ornamental gardens had once stood. Seniors who had lived their entire lives in the valley shared stories with young families just putting down roots, stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Clearwater Creek flow clear and healthy once again through the heart of the property. Mason joined me, handing me a glass of local cider. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in 40 years of dealing with water disputes, I've never seen one end quite like this." I nodded. Diane thought she could buy whatever she wanted: water, influence, impunity. She never understood what makes this valley work. "Speaking of Diane," Mason said, "heard she took a plea deal last week. Significant jail time, plus she's testifying against the corporate executives who backed her operation." "Good," I said simply. There was no satisfaction in another person's downfall, even someone who had caused so much damage. The real victory wasn't seeing Diane punished, it was seeing our community strengthened. Later that evening, as the celebration continued and the sun set behind the mountains, I walked along the creek that had been at the center of our conflict. The water flowed steadily, neither diminished by theft nor poisoned by vengeance. It was simply water doing what water does, nourishing life, connecting communities, flowing forward. In the end, that's what Diane never understood. Water isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold. It's the lifeblood of the land and the people who care for it. And in Montana, we protect what matters, not just with laws and rights, but with the unbreakable bonds of community that are, like water itself, more powerful than any one person's greed could ever comprehend. 3 years after the water war that shook our valley, I stood at the edge of my alfalfa field, watching the irrigation water flow smoothly through the channels. The spring thaw had been generous this year, filling Clearwater Creek to its banks and promising a bountiful growing season. My crops were thriving, the cattle healthy, and the farm more productive than it had been in decades. But the most significant, changes in Pinewood Valley went far beyond my property line. The scandal surrounding Diane Porter and her corporate backers had triggered investigations in watersheds across the West. Similar operations were uncovered in Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada, all using the same playbook of buying strategic properties, manipulating local regulations, and extracting water resources for commercial bottling. Class action lawsuits were now working their way through the courts, with rural communities demanding accountability for depleted aquifers and compromised watersheds. Our small valley had unwittingly become ground zero for a national conversation about water rights, corporate resource extraction, and the vulnerability of rural communities. Journalists, environmental activists, and policy experts still occasionally made pilgrimages to Pinewood Valley, treating our experience as a case study in both corporate overreach and community resilience. The transformation of the former Porter property into the Pinewood Valley Agricultural Center had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as a simple reclamation project had evolved into a thriving hub for sustainable farming education, water conservation innovation, and community gathering. The State University had established a satellite research program there, studying drought-resistant crops and efficient irrigation techniques. Local schools brought students for hands-on science education about watershed ecology. Most importantly, the center had become neutral ground where long-time agricultural families and newer conservation-minded residents found common purpose. The false dichotomy Diane had tried to create between traditional and progressive approaches to land and water management had been replaced by a collaborative spirit that recognized we all wanted the same thing: a healthy, sustainable future for the valley we called home. That morning, I was meeting Mason at the center to discuss a new watershed protection initiative that would extend beyond our valley to neighboring communities. As I parked my truck, I noticed a tour bus in the lot, another group of visitors coming to learn from our experience. I found Mason in the main building, formerly Diane's ostentatious great room, now converted into a practical meeting and education space. The chandeliers had been replaced with energy-efficient lighting, and the imported marble flooring covered with serviceable local timber. Maps of the watershed covered walls, once adorned with expensive abstract art. "Right on time," Mason greeted me, gesturing toward a group of visitors listening attentively to a presentation. "These folks are from a valley in Wyoming facing a similar situation. Corporate interests trying to secure water rights for a bottling operation." I nodded in understanding. "They want to know how we handled it? They want to prevent it from happening in the first place," Mason said. "Your story has become something of a cautionary tale for communities and a warning to corporations. Nobody wants to be the next Diane Porter." After the visitors' tour concluded, their community leader, a woman named Elena, approached me. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for sharing your experience with us. Your valley's response to corporate water exploitation has given our community a roadmap for protecting our own resources." "We learned the hard way," I told her. "The best advice I can give is to strengthen your community bonds now, before you need them." The water itself wasn't what saved us. It was people coming together to protect something we all valued. As Elena's group departed, I walked with Mason through the demonstration gardens that had replaced Diane's manicured lawns. School children were getting a lesson on native plants that conserved water while supporting local pollinators. The irony wasn't lost on me. The property once designed to privatize and commercialize our water resources was now educating future generations about conservation and community stewardship. "Did you see the news about Clearwater Springs?" Mason asked as we surveyed the thriving garden plots. I shook my head. "Missed it." The parent corporation finally settled the federal case. $500 million in fines and restoration funds. Some of that money is coming back to communities like ours that were targeted for water extraction. "Better late than never," I remarked. "Any word on Diane herself?" Mason nodded. "Serving year 2 of a 5-year sentence. Her testimony helped prosecutors secure convictions against the corporate executives who backed her. Seems she's had a change of heart, giving interviews about corporate exploitation of rural resources, even writing a book, apparently." I absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Diane had caused immense damage to our community, yet the system she represented was much larger than any individual. Perhaps her newfound contrition was genuine, or perhaps it was just another calculated move. Either way, the important thing was that the structures that enabled her actions were being dismantled. That afternoon, I hosted a gathering at my farm for the families who had stood with me during the conflict. Bill Hoffman and his wife, the Petersons, Jim Baker, and a dozen others who had formed the core of our resistance. We had made this an annual tradition, a cookout beside the creek that had nearly been destroyed, a moment to reflect on how close we'd come to losing something precious. As we shared food and stories, Bill raised his glass in a toast. 3 years ago, we thought we were fighting for water. Turns out we were fighting for something bigger, the soul of this valley. Nods and murmurs of agreement circled the gathering. The water war had changed us all in ways we couldn't have anticipated. Property lines that once sharply divided neighbors had softened as we recognized our shared dependence on the watershed. Old rivalries had given way to mutual respect. Even the newcomers, who had initially been viewed with suspicion, were now integrated into the community fabric. After sunset, as the gathering wound down and people headed home, I walked alone to the spot where I had first discovered Diane's illegal pipeline. The area had been fully restored, with native grasses and wildflowers growing where the diversion had once been hidden. No sign remained of the conflict that had started here. The next morning, I had an unexpected visitor. Stephen Chen, the contractor, whose evidence had been crucial to exposing Diane's scheme, pulled up to my house in a pickup truck loaded with equipment. "Morning, Alex," he called as he got out. "Thought you might want to see this." He unfolded a set of plans on my porch table, detailed drawings for a valley-wide water monitoring system that would provide real-time data on flow rates, quality, and usage throughout the watershed. "The settlement funds from the Clearwater Springs case are paying for it," Stephen explained. "Every property owner in the valley will have access to the data, complete transparency about our shared resource." I studied the plans with a growing sense of satisfaction. So nobody can ever secretly divert water again, not without everyone knowing immediately, Stephen confirmed. "The county commissioners have already approved it. Installation starts next month." As Stephen left, I reflected on how thoroughly this community had transformed defeat into victory. What Diane Porter had intended as exploitation had instead catalyzed a revolution in how we managed and protected our most precious resource. Later that week, I received a letter that brought the entire saga full circle. It was from the State Water Rights Board, informing me that the water allocation Diane had attempted to steal had been permanently secured for agricultural use through a new conservation easement. No future owner of my property could ever sell those rights separately from the land, ensuring that the water would forever remain tied to its historical purpose of growing food and supporting the working landscape. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Clearwater Creek glittered in the distance, flowing as it had for countless millennia, indifferent to human conflicts that arose and subsided along its banks. The water would remain long after all of us were gone, continuing its patient journey. From mountain snowpack to valley soil, Diane Porter had come to our valley, seeing only what she could take. She left, having inadvertently given us something precious, a renewed understanding of what truly mattered and the determination to protect it at all costs. In the quiet of the evening, with the first stars appearing overhead and the gentle sound of flowing water in the distance, I raised my glass in a silent toast, not to victory or vindication, but to resilience, to community, and to the endless flow of water that, like justice itself, may be diverted for a time, but always finds its way home. 5 years to the day after Diane Porter fled our valley, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was from a federal correctional facility in Minnesota, and the handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar. I almost discarded it unopened, assuming it was some kind of scam, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a 10-page handwritten letter from Diane herself. "Mr. Mercer," it began, "you may be surprised to hear from me, and I would understand if you choose to discard this letter without reading further. But as I near the end of my sentence, I find myself compelled to reach out to the person whose life I tried so hard to destroy." I sat down at my kitchen table, equal parts wary and intrigued, and continued reading. What followed was something I never expected, a thoughtful, seemingly genuine reflection on her actions and their consequences. She wrote about the corporate culture that had shaped her worldview, where natural resources were just assets on a balance sheet and rural communities were obstacles to be managed or circumvented. She described how her success in previous water acquisition projects had fueled her arrogance and sense of invincibility. "I truly believed I was bringing progress and economic development," she wrote. "I had convinced myself that my ends justified any means. It took losing everything, my freedom, my reputation, my career, to make me question those assumptions." The most surprising part came near the end of the letter. Diane explained that her time in prison had given her an unexpected education. She had been assigned to a prison program that maintained a small organic garden, providing fresh produce. For the facility's kitchen, working with plants, soil, and yes, water, had connected her to the natural world in a way her privileged life never had. "There is a humbling honesty in growing things," she wrote. "The land doesn't care about your credentials or connections. A plant will die without water, regardless of how important you think you are." I wish I had understood that before trying. To control resources I never truly valued. I set the letter down, unsure how to feel. Was this genuine remorse, or another calculated move from someone who had proven herself capable of extraordinary manipulation? She was due for release soon. Was this letter laying groundwork for some new scheme? I decided to share the letter with Mason when we met for our regular coffee at the diner the next morning. He read it carefully, his weathered face impassive. "Could be genuine," he said finally, sliding the pages back across the table. Prison changes some people, or it could be part of her rehabilitation program, making amends to those she harmed. You think I should respond? I asked. Mason shrugged. That's entirely up to you, Alex. Just remember that forgiveness and trust are two different things. I mulled over his words for several days before finally sitting down to write a brief, careful response. I acknowledged receipt of her letter and expressed hope that her reflections were genuine. I shared some details about how our valley had transformed since her departure. The community agricultural center, the water monitoring system, the strengthened bonds between neighbors. I didn't offer forgiveness or friendship, but I did leave. The door open for continued correspondence if her intentions were sincere. 2 weeks later, I received another letter. This one included a formal written apology that Diane asked permission to share with other valley residents she had harmed. She also enclosed a draft manuscript. She had indeed written a book during her incarceration, titled Liquid Assets, a Corporate Water Grabber's Reckoning. It was a detailed exposé of the industry practices she had once championed, including naming companies, executives, and specific strategies used to acquire water rights across the West. My attorney tells me publishing this will likely result in multiple lawsuits, she wrote. I'm prepared for that. It's a small price to pay for the damage I've enabled. I shared the manuscript with Mason and a few trusted neighbors. The information it contained was explosive. Internal corporate memos, confidential strategies, financial projections based on water scarcity. If published, it would provide communities like ours with a powerful tool to protect themselves against similar schemes. If even half of this is accurate, it's going to send shockwaves through the water rights world, Mason said, after reviewing the manuscript. The question is whether to trust the source. That question lingered as Diane Porter's release date approached. The national media had begun running stories anticipating the publication of her tell-all book. Corporate lawyers were already issuing preemptive statements discrediting her as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Environmental groups were cautiously celebrating the potential revelations. And then, a week before her scheduled release, another letter arrived, this one from Diane's attorney. Diane Porter had died of complications from pneumonia while still in custody. Her final wish was that her manuscript be published posthumously, with all proceeds going to a newly established foundation for watershed protection in rural communities. The news hit me in an unexpected way. Diane had been the villain in our valley's story, yet her final act suggested a genuine transformation, or perhaps it was a last attempt at reputation rehabilitation. I would never know for certain. What I did know was that her manuscript, published 3 months later, became a powerful catalyst for change. State legislatures began reviewing water rights laws. Federal agencies launched investigations into corporate water acquisition practices. Rural communities formed coalitions to protect their watersheds. The ripple effects of our small valley's water war continued to spread. 1 year after Diane's death, the first grants from the Porter Watershed Protection Foundation were awarded to 5 rural communities facing challenges similar to what we had experienced. I was invited to serve on the selection committee, a request that struck me as both ironic and fitting. After some consideration, I accepted. At the Foundation's inaugural conference, I found myself addressing a room full of farmers, ranchers, environmental advocates and community leaders, all united by concern for their local water resources. As I shared our valley's story, I realized that Diane Porter had become something unexpected in death, a cautionary tale that was helping to prevent similar exploitation elsewhere. The greatest protection against water theft isn't laws or regulations, though those are important, I told the attendees. It's awareness and community vigilance. Know your resources, know your rights, and know your neighbors. After my presentation, a young farmer from Arizona approached me. "Your story gives me hope," she said. "We're fighting a similar battle against a corporation trying to pump our aquifer for bottled water export. Sometimes it feels impossible to stand up to that kind of money and power." I felt the same way, I assured her. "Just remember that water creates communities for a reason. We need each other to protect it, just as we need it to survive." 10 years after I first discovered the illegal pipeline on my property line, Pinewood Valley had been transformed in ways none of us could have imagined. The agricultural center had expanded to include a research station studying climate-resilient farming techniques. Our water monitoring system had become a model replicated in watersheds across the West. The community bonds forged in conflict had evolved into innovative cooperative approaches to resource management. Most remarkably, the corporate threat that had once seemed so overwhelming had inadvertently vaccinated our community against similar dangers. When new development proposals emerged, they were met with informed scrutiny rather than naive acceptance. Water rights were discussed with nuanced understanding at town meetings. Even children in the local schools could explain the basics of watershed protection and monitoring. On the anniversary of the water contamination incident, we now held an annual Watershed Appreciation Day that combined education, celebration, and recommitment to protection of our shared resources. What had begun as a bitter conflict had evolved into a community tradition that strengthened rather than divided us. That year, as I helped set up tables for the community potluck beside Clearwater Creek, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us here. The crystal-clear water flowing past bore no trace of the contamination that had once threatened it. Nature's resilience had matched our own, healing what had been damaged. Bill Hoffman joined me, gazing at the stream with similar appreciation. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years since you first spotted that illegal pipeline," he remarked. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't investigated." The thought was sobering. If I had ignored the dropping water levels, convinced myself it was just drought or climate change, how different might our valley be today? How many other communities had missed similar warning signs and lost their water rights as a result? "Got lucky," I admitted. "Right place, right time, right stubbornness." Bill laughed. "Don't sell yourself short. You stood your ground when most would have given up. That $50,000 bribe would have tempted plenty of folks." "Now worth every penny we didn't take," I replied, watching families gather along. The creek banks, children playing in the shallows under watchful eyes. As the celebration began, with trestle tables laden with food grown in the valley and the community band setting up for an evening concert, I found a quiet moment to walk alone to the spot where it had all begun. The boundary between my property and what had once been Diane Porter's retreat was now marked not by fences, but by a small educational kiosk explaining the watershed and the importance of water rights. A plaque on the kiosk contained a quote that the community had selected after much discussion. "Water is the lifeblood of our communities, connecting us to each other and to the land we share. What we take, what we give, and what we protect defines not just our landscape but our legacy." I ran my fingers over the words, thinking about legacy. Diane Porter had come to our valley seeking to build her own legacy through exploitation and had instead created one through her downfall and unexpected redemption. My own legacy would be this land, maintained and eventually passed to the next generation of stewards. The community's legacy would be the institutions and practices we had, built to protect our shared resources. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the creek with golden light, I made my way back to the celebration. Children were releasing native fish fingerlings into the restored creek under the guidance of conservation officers. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shared food and stories like family. Watershed maps and monitoring data were displayed alongside art inspired by the landscape. This, I realized, was the true power of water, not as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as the essential element that connects and sustains us all. What had begun as my solitary fight to protect my farm's irrigation had expanded into something far more meaningful. A community, awakening to the value of what had always flowed through our lives, too essential to notice until it was nearly lost. In the end, we hadn't just saved our water had saved us, washing away artificial boundaries between neighbors and nourishing the roots of a community that would stand strong against whatever challenges the future might bring. 20 years have passed since that bone-dry irrigation. Channel first alerted me to Diane Porter's water theft. My hair has grayed, my hands have grown more weathered, but Clearwater Creek still flows true and strong through our valley. Sometimes visitors ask me to retell the story of our water war, now something of a legend in rural conservation circles. They expect tales of villains vanquished and heroes triumphant, but that's not the story I tell. Instead, I talk about transformation, how a crisis revealed the true value of what we had taken for granted, how a community discovered its strength, how even Diane found redemption in unexpected ways. Standing on my porch this morning, watching the sunrise gild the mountains and the creek sparkling below, I felt profound gratitude, not just for the water that sustains my farm, but for the invisible connections it created between all of us who call this valley home. Water, like justice, follows natural laws that human greed cannot long defy. It carves its path with patient persistence, bringing life where it flows and washing clean what was sullied, and in the end, it always finds its way home.